Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight we're traveling to the hills of West Virginia, to a small town where neighbors know each other's names, and trust runs deep. This is a story about ordinary people living ordinary lives, until those lives became tangled in something extraordinary and tragic. Take a deep breath. Let it out slowly. There's no rush here. We have all the time we need. This is the story of Michael Cochran. In the heart of Appalachia sits Beckley, West Virginia. It's the kind of place where weekends mean Little League games and backyard barbecues, where the air smells like fresh-cut grass in the summer and wood smoke in the winter. The houses are modest but well-kept, and the people wave to each other from their front porches. Michael Brandon Cochran was born in Beckley on December 23rd. 1980, he grew up there, surrounded by the green mountains and winding roads that define that part of the country. His mother, Donna Bolt, loved him fiercely, and after she remarried, Michael gained a stepfather named Eddie, who would come to love him as his own son. Michael grew into a friendly, athletic young man. He had an easy smile and a genuine way about him that made people want to be around him. He loved computers, loved sports, loved being active. He was the kind of person who seemed to fit naturally into his community, someone you could count on to show up and help out when needed. And that's where he met Natalie Jessup. They were high school sweethearts, the kind of couple everyone assumed would last forever. Natalie was smart and driven, working toward a career in pharmacy. Michael worked with computers, a field that suited his logical mind and his patience with complex problems. They married young, during college, filled with the optimism that comes with being in love and starting a life together. By the time they settled into adulthood, they had 2 children. Their home in Daniels, just outside Beckley, became the center of their world. Michael coached youth baseball and football, standing on dusty fields under Friday night lights, teaching kids how to throw a curveball or execute a proper tackle. He was patient with them, encouraging, the kind of coach parents appreciated. Natalie worked as a pharmacist, earning a steady income. Michael handled IT work, troubleshooting networks and fixing computer problems. They seemed to have everything figured out. A nice house, 2 healthy kids, jobs that paid the bills. On the surface, it all looked perfectly normal. But beneath that surface, something else was growing. In 2017, Michael and Natalie registered a new business. They called it Tactical Solutions Group, or TSG for short. Natalie pitched it as a defense contracting company. She told people they would be bidding on government contracts, supplying equipment and technology to federal agencies and the military. It was an ambitious venture, the kind of thing that could change their lives if it succeeded, and to hear Natalie tell it, success was all but guaranteed. She approached friends first, then family, then neighbors, and acquaintances. She explained that the business needed investors to fund individual contracts. Once those contracts came through and the government paid out, everyone would get their money back, plus a generous return. It sounded legitimate. Natalie had paperwork. She showed people what looked like official contract numbers. She forwarded emails that appeared to be from government employees discussing the deals. And people believed her. Why wouldn't they? This was Natalie, someone they'd known for years. She was a pharmacist, a professional with credentials and credibility. Her husband Michael was coaching their kids. They lived right there in the neighborhood. These weren't strangers asking for money. These were members of the community. Michael's own mother, Donna, invested nearly $250,000. It was her retirement savings, money she'd worked her entire life to build. But she trusted her daughter-in-law completely. She believed in the business, believed in Natalie's promises that the money would come back multiplied. Others invested too. Friends like Tony McCall and the Davis family poured six-figure sums into TSG, drawn by the promise of substantial returns. In total, at least 11 people invested close to $2.5 million. The Cochran's lifestyle began to change noticeably. They bought a 1965 Shelby Cobra, a classic muscle car worth tens of thousands of dollars. They purchased multiple properties. They traveled, they dined out frequently at nice restaurants. They acquired jewelry and motorcycles and other expensive toys. To the outside world, it looked like TSG was thriving. The government contracts must be paying off handsomely. Michael and Natalie were living proof that taking a risk on a new business could really pay dividends. But the truth was far darker. There were no government contracts. There had never been any contracts. TSG existed only on paper. The company had never submitted a single bid to any federal agency. Every document Natalie showed investors, every email she forwarded, every contract number she referenced was fabricated or meaningless. What Natalie was running was a classic Ponzi scheme. She used money from new investors to pay partial returns to earlier investors, creating the illusion that the business was generating profits. The rest of the money went straight into her personal accounts, funding that lavish lifestyle. Michael's name appeared on some of the business documents. P.O. boxes were registered in his name, but investigators would later conclude that he knew nothing about what his wife was really doing. While Natalie presented them publicly as equal partners, she was the one controlling the money, making the decisions, crafting the lies. And as 2018 turned into 2019, those lies were becoming harder to maintain. By early 2019, people were starting to ask questions. Where were the returns they'd been promised? The contracts should have paid out by now. Some investors had been waiting for more than a year. When they pressed Natalie for answers, she always had an excuse ready. The federal government was experiencing a shutdown. That was delaying payments. Or she was undergoing cancer treatment. The chemotherapy made it hard to manage the business. Or there were complications with the bank. The money was there, sitting in an account in Virginia, but Bank of America was holding it up for some bureaucratic reason. Each excuse bought her a little more time, but the patience of her investors was wearing thin. Then there was the incident with the Shady Spring Youth Baseball League. Natalie had served as treasurer for the organization, which Michael's children participated in. A fundraiser at the Cochran home raised over $16,000 through bingo games and raffles. But that money went missing. When league officials began asking questions, they couldn't get straight answers. The check that TSG wrote as a donation bounced. A private investigator was hired to look into the missing funds. He discovered purchases to department stores, restaurants, tens of thousands of dollars being spent on personal expenses. The pattern was becoming obvious. Something was very wrong, and Michael was starting to notice too. By late January and early February of 2019, Michael seemed stressed. He mentioned to friends that he was confused about the business finances. They were supposed to have hundreds of millions of dollars locked in contracts, but no money was coming in. Investors were calling. People wanted answers. And Michael didn't have any. He decided he needed to get to the bottom of it. He and Natalie scheduled a trip to Lynchburg, Virginia, where she claimed their Bank of America account held the bulk of their funds. They arranged a chartered flight for February 6th, 2019. Michael would go to the bank himself, speak to the representatives in person, and find out exactly what was happening. But Michael never made that trip. On the morning of February 6th, Natalie canceled the flight. It was a Wednesday morning, cold for West Virginia in early February. Natalie sent a text message to her neighbor and friend Jennifer Davis. She said that she and Michael were both feeling sick. She mentioned that her blood sugar was running high because of steroid shots she'd been receiving for her cancer treatment. Then she asked Jennifer if she had any insulin. Jennifer did have insulin. Her husband was diabetic, and they kept a supply at home. She didn't think twice about helping her friend. After all, Natalie was a pharmacist. She would know how to use it properly. Around 10:45 that morning, Jennifer's husband delivered a vial of Humalog insulin to the Cochran house. What happened in the hours after that delivery would become the central question in a murder trial. At 12:29 that afternoon, Natalie took a photograph. It showed Michael lying on their kitchen floor. curled into an awkward position. His body looked limp. His face was turned away from the camera. Something about the image was deeply unsettling. Natalie sent this photo to several people, friends and family members. She offered little explanation. Michael wasn't feeling well. He'd passed out. She was keeping an eye on him. The people who received that photo were alarmed. They called her. They texted back urgently. Michael needed to go to the hospital. He needed medical attention right away. Looking at that image, anyone could see something was seriously wrong. But Natalie kept saying Michael would be fine. He just needed to sleep it off. He didn't like hospitals. He didn't want to go to Charleston. He didn't want to go to Princeton. Nowhere was good enough. She would take care of him at home. Around 1 o'clock, Natalie asked 2 construction workers who knew the family to come help. They arrived at the house and found Michael on the kitchen floor, exactly as he appeared in the photograph. They moved him to a couch in the living room. Even these men who weren't medical professionals could see that Michael needed help. They urged Natalie to call 911 or take him to the hospital. She insisted he would be okay. More friends came by throughout the afternoon and early evening. Each one saw Michael's condition deteriorating. He was unresponsive. His breathing was shallow. His skin looked pale. The clock kept ticking, and nothing was getting better. Finally, around 8 o'clock that night, one friend simply insisted. They weren't asking anymore. They were taking Michael to Raleigh General Hospital, whether Natalie agreed or not. When Michael arrived at the emergency room, doctors immediately checked his vital signs. His blood glucose level was 21. For context, a normal fasting blood sugar is between 70 and 100. Anything below 54 is considered dangerously low, potentially life-threatening. Michael's level was 21. His body was in severe hypoglycemic shock. He was not diabetic. He had no medical reason to have blood sugar that low. The doctors worked quickly to stabilize him, but the damage had already been done. Michael's brain had been deprived of glucose for hours, and brain cells cannot survive long without their primary fuel source. He was placed on a ventilator. Medical staff transferred him to intensive care. His mother, Donna, who was a retired nurse, finally received a call from Natalie telling her that her son was in the hospital. By the time Dawn arrived, Michael was already unconscious. He never woke up. For 5 days, Michael remained in the hospital while his organs slowly failed. On February 11th, 2019, he was moved to hospice care. That same day, surrounded by family, Michael Brandon Cochran died. He was 38 years old. At first, Michael's death was treated as a medical mystery. The doctors couldn't definitively say what had caused such a catastrophic failure in an otherwise healthy man. The official cause of death was listed as undetermined. Natalie played the role of grieving widow. The community rallied around her and the children. Friends brought meals. Neighbors offered to help with yard work. Everyone felt terrible for this family that had lost their husband and father so suddenly. But behind the scenes, other wheels were turning. Just a few months after Michael's death, the investigation into the missing baseball league funds was expanding. Investigators were looking more closely at TSG and its financial records. What they found shocked them. There were no government contracts. There never had been. The entire business was fraudulent. Every investor had been lied to. Every promise Natalie made was empty. She'd stolen close to $2.5 million from people who trusted her. On June 25th, 2019, just 4 months after Michael's death, police executed a search warrant on the Cochran residence. They were looking for evidence related to the fraud case. And that's when they found the vial of insulin in the refrigerator. Neither Michael nor Natalie were diabetic. There was no prescription for insulin in either of their names. Yet here it was, sitting in their fridge. Investigators remembered that Michael had died from catastrophically low blood sugar. Suddenly, his death didn't look like such a mystery anymore. The medical examiner agreed to exhume Michael's body. 7 months had passed since his death, and by that time decomposition was well advanced. The examiner couldn't find any clear physical evidence that would definitively prove cause of death. The examination remained inconclusive, but the suspicion had been planted. Police kept investigating. Meanwhile, Natalie was facing federal charges. In September of 2020, she pleaded guilty to wire fraud and money laundering. In March of 2021, she was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. and ordered to pay $2.6 million in restitution. During her sentencing hearing for the fraud, the judge made a notable observation. Although Michael's name appeared on some documents, it was clear that Natalie had been the mastermind behind the scheme. She had controlled everything. She had made all the decisions. Michael appeared to have been just as much a victim as the investors. 6 months into her federal prison sentence, in November 2021, Natalie Cochran was indicted for the murder of her husband. The case against Natalie presented unique challenges. There was no smoking gun, no surveillance footage, no witness who had seen her inject Michael with insulin. The insulin vial had a puncture mark, but forensic experts couldn't say when that puncture was made or by whom. There were no fingerprints that could be analyzed. Michael's body had been exhumed once, but the examination hadn't yielded the evidence prosecutors needed. In 2023, they made an extraordinary request. They wanted to exhume Michael's body again, conduct another autopsy, bring in specialists. The Bolt family agreed. They wanted answers. They wanted justice for their son, Dr. Paul Uribe, a forensic pathologist who had previously worked on a series of insulin murders at a veterans hospital in West Virginia, was brought in to examine the case. By the time of the second exhumation, Michael's remains were largely skeletal. There was no soft tissue left to examine, no way to find an injection site or detect insulin directly in the body. But Dr. Uribe looked at something else: the totality of the medical records from Michael's hospitalization. He examined every test result, every doctor's note, every piece of data from those 5 days in February 2019. He looked at the blood sugar level of 21 when Michael arrived at the hospital. He looked at the fluctuations in glucose over the following hours. He noted the low potassium levels, which often accompany insulin overdose. He systematically ruled out other possible causes: sepsis, infection, natural metabolic disorders. None of them fit the pattern. In Dr. Uribe's expert opinion, there was only one credible explanation for what happened to Michael Cochran. Someone had given him a massive dose of insulin. The case was refiled in October 2023. This time, prosecutors felt they had enough to proceed. In January of 2025, nearly 6 years after Michael's death, Natalie Cochran's murder trial began in Raleigh County Circuit Court. Court TV streamed the proceedings live, drawing national attention to this small West Virginia community. The prosecution's theory was straightforward. On February 6, 2019, Michael and Natalie were scheduled to fly to Virginia to confront the bank about their supposedly frozen funds. If Michael made that trip, he would learn the truth. There were no frozen funds. There never had been. The entire business was a fraud. Once Michael knew, the scheme would unravel completely. Natalie would lose everything. So she made sure Michael never made that trip. She obtained insulin from her neighbor under false pretenses, claiming it was for her own use. At some point that morning or early afternoon, prosecutors argued she injected Michael with a massive dose of the drug. As his blood sugar plummeted, he became disoriented, then collapsed. Instead of immediately getting him help, she waited. She sent the photograph to friends, establishing a timeline that made her look like a concerned wife. She resisted taking him to the hospital for as long as possible. By the time Michael finally received medical care, hours had passed. The damage to his brain was irreversible. The prosecution called several expert witnesses. Dr. Diane Krieger, an endocrinologist, testified that the only credible explanation for Michael's hypoglycemia was insulin injection. She explained that the low potassium levels in his blood supported this conclusion. She noted that Humalog insulin, the type Jennifer Davis had provided, acts quickly but also leaves the system relatively quickly. By the time doctors tested Michael's blood sugar hours later, the insulin itself might no longer be detectable, but its devastating effects remained. Dr. Paul Uribe explained his methodology for ruling out alternative causes of death. He walked the jury through why natural metabolic conditions, supplements, steroids, or accidental ingestion couldn't explain what happened. This was homicide, he testified. Someone had deliberately given Michael insulin knowing he didn't need it. Investigators testified about the Ponzi scheme. They showed the jury how Michael's name might have been on documents, but all the evidence suggested he had no idea what Natalie was really doing. They presented text messages showing how Natalie had subtly worked to isolate Michael from his mother and stepfather, making it harder for him to get outside perspectives on the business. Perhaps most damning was a text message sent from Michael's phone after Natalie had already photographed him unconscious on the floor. The timestamp proved Michael couldn't possibly have sent it himself. Natalie must have been using his phone, trying to maintain the illusion that everything was normal for just a little while longer. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial. They brought their own forensic pathologists who testified that Michael's cause of death remained undetermined and undeterminable, given the condition of his remains. They suggested that Michael might have been taking unprescribed supplements or even insulin himself as part of bodybuilding efforts. They questioned how Natalie, a small woman barely over 5 feet tall, could have injected her large athletic husband without him resisting. The defense also argued that if Michael was truly involved in running TSG, he must have known about the fraud. If he knew, then Natalie had no motive to kill him. The whole prosecution theory fell apart, but prosecutors pointed to the financial records. Michael received no salary from TSG. He appeared to have no independent knowledge of the business operations. In text messages and conversations with friends, he seemed genuinely confused about why no money was coming in. The evidence suggested he was as much in the dark as everyone else. After nearly 3 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury on January 29th. 2025. They began deliberations at 9:34 in the morning. At 11:30, they returned with a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. In West Virginia, a murder conviction doesn't automatically mean life in prison without parole. The jury must decide whether to grant mercy. If they recommend mercy, the defendant becomes eligible for parole after 15 years. If they deny mercy, the sentence is life without any possibility of parole. The next phase of the trial allowed victim impact statements. Friends and family members stood up to describe how Michael's death and Natalie's betrayal had affected their lives. Donna Bolt, Michael's mother, spoke through tears. She talked about the 6-year journey to get justice for her son. She described the evil and sinister nature of what Natalie had done, not just to Michael but to everyone who had trusted her. She asked the jury to show no mercy. Others spoke about the financial devastation. Tony McCall had lost hundreds of thousands of dollars. She talked about how much worse the betrayal felt, because it had come from someone she considered a friend. It wasn't just the money, it was the trust that had been shattered. The children, now teenagers, had also testified during the trial. They'd been put in the impossible position of speaking about their father's death, while their mother sat at the defense table. The emotional toll on them was visible to everyone in the courtroom. The jury deliberated again. When they returned, their decision was unanimous: no mercy. Natalie Cochran was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She became the first woman in West Virginia since 1991 to be convicted of murder and denied mercy by a jury. She showed no visible reaction as the sentence was read. The story didn't end with the verdict. In February 2025, Natalie's defense attorneys filed a motion for acquittal, arguing that the evidence had been insufficient to prove murder beyond a reasonable doubt. They claimed the trial court had made multiple errors. As of now, that motion remains pending. But for Michael's family, a measure of justice had been achieved. After 6 years of waiting, of pushing for answers, of refusing to accept that Michael's death was just an unfortunate medical mystery, they had their answer. In the wake of the trial, West Virginia lawmakers introduced legislation in Michael's memory. House Bill 2789, known as the Michael Brandon Cochran Act, would require intensive care units to conduct specific tests for insulin in unconscious patients, or those with unexplained hypoglycemia. The goal is to help doctors recognize when insulin might be involved in a suspicious medical emergency. It's a small piece of Michael's legacy, a way to prevent another family from going through what the Bolts endured. Michael's mother keeps his memory alive in other ways too. She posts on social media about the case, about the resolution that marked the signing of the legislation in his name. She shares stories from strangers who approach her in stores to offer their condolences and support. She talks about faith, about perseverance, about the long road to justice. The community of Beckley has slowly begun to heal. The betrayal cut deep. These were people who had invested not just their money, but their trust. They believed they were helping a friend, supporting a local business, being part of something good. Instead, they learned that the person they'd welcomed into their homes, the woman they'd known for years, had been systematically deceiving them. And when that deception threatened to be exposed, she'd murdered her own husband to keep the secret. Michael Cochran should still be here. He should be in his mid-40s now, coaching another generation of kids in baseball and football. He should be watching his own children grow up, graduate, start their own lives. He should be working at his computer, solving problems, helping people navigate technology. Instead, he's buried in Sunset Memorial Park in West Virginia. His life was cut short by the person who stood beside him and promised to love and cherish him, the person who shared his home and his children, the person he trusted above all others. In the end, that's what makes this story so tragic. It wasn't a stranger who killed Michael. It wasn't a random act of violence. It was an act of cold calculation by someone who decided that her secret was more important than his life. The case stands as a reminder of how well people can hide darkness behind a pleasant facade. Natalie Cochran was a pharmacist, a mother, a respected member of her community. She smiled at neighbors, volunteered at her children's school, attended church. No one suspected what she was capable of until it was far too late. But it also stands as a testament to persistence. Donna and Eddie Bolt never stopped pushing for answers. They never accepted the initial ruling of an undetermined cause of death. They kept asking questions, kept demanding investigations, kept their son's case alive when it would have been easier to let it fade away. 6 years is a long time to wait for justice. But they waited. And in the end, the truth came out. Michael's story is now part of the public record, told in courtrooms and on television, written about in newspapers and discussed in podcasts. But beyond the headlines and the legal proceedings, he was a real person. He was someone's son, someone's friend, someone's father. He mattered. His life had value. And now finally, that has been recognized. Take a slow, deep breath. Let your muscles relax. Let your mind settle. This story is over now. Michael's case is closed. His mother can finally rest, knowing that the person responsible has been held accountable. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight we're going to explore a story that unfolds slowly, carefully. A story about service, sacrifice, and the darkness that can hide behind closed doors. So let your mind drift as we walk through this case together, at a gentle pace. This is the story of Ashley Henning. The summer evening air hung heavy over Rhineyville, Kentucky in late June of 2023. It was a small community, the kind of place where neighbors knew each other, where military families from nearby Fort Knox made their homes, where children rode bikes down quiet suburban streets. Ashley Henning had built a life here. At 37 years old, she was a master sergeant in the United States Army, a rank that spoke to nearly 2 decades of dedication and service. Her military career had begun in 2005. When she was just a young woman starting out, she'd chosen a path that few take, one that demands everything. Over those 18 years, Ashley had deployed to some of the most challenging theaters of modern warfare: Iraq from 2006 to 2007, Afghanistan from 2009 to 2010, Kuwait from 2015 to 2016. These weren't just assignments. They were chapters of her life, months and years spent far from home, doing work that most people would never truly understand. Her uniform bore the weight of her service. 6 Army Commendation Medals, 4 Army Achievement Awards, 5 Army Good Conduct Medals, campaign medals from Afghanistan and Iraq, ribbons and honors that told the story of a soldier who had earned respect, who had proven herself again and again. Those who knew Ashley described her with warmth. She was bubbly, they said. The kind of person whose energy filled a room. A dedicated mother. A loyal friend. Someone who brought light with her. But there was another side to Ashley's life. The June evening. A private side, hidden behind the closed doors of her home. In the La Vista Estates subdivision, a marriage that, to those on the outside, seemed solid enough. But marriages can be complicated things, and sometimes what appears solid from the outside is crumbling within. Ashley had married Jordan Henning. He too was military, stationed at Fort Knox like she was. They had children together. They had built what looked like a life, but underneath something was fracturing. June 26, 2023 was Ashley's 37th birthday. She'd planned a party, the way people do when they want to celebrate, to gather friends and family around them to mark another year of life. The afternoon unfolded as these gatherings do. Friends arrived. There was food, conversation, laughter, the kind of casual celebration that happens in backyards across America on summer days. A slip and slide was set up for the children. The adults stood around talking, drinking, enjoying the warm weather. But as the evening wore on, something shifted. Ashley and Jordan began to argue. At first, perhaps the guests tried to ignore it, the way people do when a couple has words at a party. But the tension grew. The argument became harder to overlook. Neighbors who were there, friends who had come to celebrate. They tried to intervene. They tried to calm things down. But their efforts didn't work. The mood had soured. One by one, the guests began to leave. What had started as a celebration was ending in discomfort and concern. As people departed, the house grew quieter. The party was over. Now it was just Ashley and Jordan, left to clean up the remnants of what should have been a joyful day. The slip and slide needed to be put away. Dishes needed washing. The ordinary tasks that follow every party. Inside their home, surveillance cameras captured what happened next. The kind of home security cameras that many families install, little devices meant to provide peace of mind, to keep watch. These cameras had been there for a while. Jordan had helped install them himself. The footage shows Ashley and Jordan moving through their kitchen, cleaning up. But the argument from earlier hadn't ended. If anything, it was intensifying. The disagreement was about something seemingly small, about who should put away the slip and slide, about whether Jordan should do it, or whether one of the children should. But beneath that surface argument, there were deeper things. Years of accumulated resentments. Complaints about their marriage, about intimacy, about respect, about all the small wounds that can accumulate in a relationship until they form something much larger. The tension escalated. Ashley's son, sensing danger, did what frightened children do. He ran to a neighbor's house, looking for help. Jimmy Watts was that neighbor. A man who lived nearby, someone who knew the Hennings, had been friendly with them. When Ashley's son came to his door, frightened, saying there was trouble at home, Watts didn't hesitate. He went to help. What Watts walked into was a situation spiraling out of control. Jordan and Ashley were still arguing intensely. Watts tried to intervene, tried to de-escalate, to calm things down, but Jordan didn't respond well to his presence. According to Watts's later testimony, Jordan became physical with him, threatened him, put him in a headlock. Watts managed to break free. He fled the house, and once outside, safely away, he did what people do in emergencies. He called 911. But Jordan, inside the house, had heard him making that call, and something about that phone call, about the police being contacted, became a breaking point. Jordan went upstairs. He went to the bedroom, and he retrieved a gun. What happened next was captured by those home security cameras. Silent witnesses mounted on the walls, recording everything. The footage is difficult to watch. It shows Jordan coming back downstairs with the weapon. It shows him confronting Ashley in the kitchen. It shows him shooting her. Not once, multiple times. 4 shots. Ashley, struck, fell. The cameras captured her collapsing, wounded, bleeding, and then Jordan did something that would later be emphasized by prosecutors as evidence of intent. He left the room. He went to reload the gun. He chambered new rounds. And then he came back. He fired again. One more shot into Ashley as she lay on the kitchen floor. The cameras captured one more detail that prosecutors would later highlight. After shooting Ashley that final time, Jordan spat on her body. Then he left, he got into his vehicle and drove away, leaving Ashley dying on the kitchen floor. He was arrested a mile from the house. According to the police report, he apologized during his arrest. "I'm sorry," he said, but Ashley was gone. She was posthumously promoted that same day, on what should have been a day of celebration. She became Master Sergeant Ashley Henning in death, an honor that recognized her years of service. But it was an honor she would never know about. She was 37 years old, a mother, a soldier, gone. Months later, the case went to trial. Jordan Henning was charged with murder. The prosecution argued that this was intentional killing, driven by hatred that had built up over time. They pointed to the video evidence. They pointed to the fact that Jordan had reloaded. They pointed to him spitting on Ashley's body. How could this be anything other than deliberate murder? But Jordan's defense team presented a different narrative. They argued that Jordan had broken, that he had suffered an extreme emotional disturbance, that years of alleged abuse from Ashley had built up until he snapped. In Kentucky law, there's a provision for this. If a jury believes someone acted under an extreme emotional disturbance, they can reduce a murder charge to manslaughter. It requires showing that the person's judgment was so impaired that they weren't fully in control. Jordan took the stand in his own defense. Tearfully, he told the jury about his marriage. He claimed Ashley had abused him for years. Physically, he said. Emotionally. He said she had pushed him downstairs, bitten him, hit him. He said she had emasculated him, that she outranked him in the military and used that against him. He said she had squeezed his genitals during the party that night, part of a pattern of abuse. He said that when the neighbor called 911, he feared for his life. He feared his military career was over. He feared his wife might harm him. He said he grabbed the gun because of those fears. And then he said he didn't remember shooting her. He said he just broke, that he found himself standing over her, gun in hand, not knowing how he got there. The prosecution argued differently. They said Jordan went for that gun the moment he realized police were coming, that his military career was indeed about to end, but not because of Ashley, because of his own actions. They said he shot Ashley not in self-defense or in some uncontrolled break, but in rage, in punishment for her daring to call for help, for threatening to expose whatever he wanted kept hidden. There were other details that emerged during the trial. Testimonies from Ashley's friends who said they'd never seen her be abusive. Testimonies from Jordan's military colleagues who spoke to his character. Expert witnesses debating the psychology of extreme emotional disturbance. And there was that video, played for the jury, showing exactly what happened in that kitchen. After hearing all the evidence, after watching that terrible footage, after listening to both sides present their cases, the jury deliberated for 4 hours. They came back with a verdict. Guilty, but not of murder, of first-degree manslaughter. The lesser charge. They had apparently accepted, at least to some degree, the defense argument about extreme emotional disturbance. In the courtroom, there was shock. Ashley's family and friends couldn't believe it. Her cousin John Williams, a Marine Corps chief warrant officer, was so overcome with anger that he called the jurors cowards right there in the courtroom. The judge had to threaten him with jail time to maintain order. The same jury then had to decide on sentencing. For manslaughter in Kentucky, the maximum is 20 years. They deliberated for just 10 minutes before giving Jordan the maximum, 20 years. He would have to serve 85% of that before being eligible for parole, 17 years. But to Ashley's loved ones, it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. They believed the jury had gotten it wrong. They pointed to the video evidence. How could anyone watch that and think this was anything less than murder? They believed racial bias had played a role. Ashley was black. Jordan was white. The one black juror had been dismissed as an alternate. A deliberating jury was all white. Had the tables been turned and she killed her white husband, she would have been held accountable and done much more time than 20 years, said Holly Victorino, one of Ashley's friends. At his formal sentencing in May of 2025, Jordan addressed the court. He was tearful, apologetic. "I'm sorry for the pain that I've caused all of you," he said. He addressed Ashley directly, using a nickname, Pooh Bear. I love you and I'm sorry I took you away from us all. He addressed his children. I'm sorry I took Mom away from you. He insisted. Despite what people may think, I loved Ashley. I miss her and I think about her every day. Our marriage wasn't perfect and she didn't deserve what happened to her that day. But Ashley's brother spoke too. He had words for Jordan that were far less gentle. He said Jordan had manipulated the jury. He said Jordan had been living a double life. He referenced evidence that had come out about Jordan's activities on a fetish website called FetLife. Evidence suggesting Jordan had interests and a lifestyle he'd kept hidden from Ashley. You made Ashley the villain, discovering who you really are, her brother said. She found out and that terrified you. You told her you're going to ruin my image. We all heard it on camera. When Ashley said she had enough, you made sure she wouldn't say another word to another soul. He contrasted their military service. She was a decorated soldier. She served our country in Iraq and Afghanistan with honor and courage. You don't get to stay in your shadow and pretend you wore the same uniform the same way she did. You're a disgrace to every man and woman who's ever served the country in uniform with integrity. Later, Jordan tried one more time to reduce his sentence. He petitioned the court under a Kentucky law that allows abuse victims who kill their abusers to serve. Reduced time. He claimed again that he had been the victim. At that hearing, he detailed alleged incidents of abuse. He identified his profile on that fetish website. But prosecutors brought evidence showing that the things Jordan claimed were abuse were actually kinks he had listed on his profile as interests. Things he had sought out even while married to Ashley. Judge Larry Ashlock denied the petition. Mr. Henning was not a victim of domestic violence, he said. There was nothing, and I mean nothing, in that video from Miss Henning that indicates to the court that there was any domestic violence on her part. The courtroom erupted in applause. Ashley's family and friends finally felt heard, at least in that moment. Jordan would serve his 20 years. No reduction. And so the legal case ended. Jordan Henning sits in prison. He won't be eligible for parole until around 2042. But the case raises questions that linger like smoke in the air. Questions about domestic violence and who gets believed. Questions about how race affects justice. Questions about what really happened in that marriage. Behind closed doors, before that terrible night, was Jordan a victim who finally broke? Or was he a man who killed his wife to silence her, to prevent her from exposing things he wanted kept secret? The jury said one thing. Ashley's family believes another. And Ashley, the only other person who truly knew, is gone. What we know for certain is this. Ashley Henning served her country with honor. She deployed to war zones. She earned her rank. She raised children. She had friends who loved her, who described her as warm and vibrant. And on her 37th birthday, after a party meant to celebrate her life, she died on her kitchen floor, shot by the man she had married. 3 children lost their mother that night. A family lost a daughter, a sister, a cousin. The military lost a dedicated soldier. And a small community in Kentucky was reminded that violence can erupt anywhere, even in homes that look peaceful from the outside. The surveillance cameras in that house were meant to provide security, to keep the family safe. Instead, they became witnesses to a tragedy, silent watchers who recorded everything but could do nothing to prevent it. Sometimes the tools we think will protect us can only document our losses. The case of Ashley Henning speaks to larger questions about domestic violence, about military families and the stresses they face, about justice and whether it's truly blind. It speaks to the way trauma can echo through generations. Ashley's children will carry this with them always. The weight of that night, the knowledge of what happened in their home, the complicated grief of losing a mother, and in a different way losing a father too. It speaks to the courage of those who serve in uniform, knowing that sometimes the danger they face isn't on a battlefield overseas, but in their own homes. And it speaks to the complexity of truth. In court, there are 2 sides, each presenting their version of events, but the real truth is often more complicated than either narrative captures. It exists in the nuances, the small moments, the things that aren't captured even by video cameras. What we can say with certainty is that a life was lost, a life that had value, a life of service and sacrifice. Ashley Henning deserved better than the end she got. As you drift off tonight, think about the weight of service. Think about the people who choose to wear the uniform, who deploy to distant places, who make sacrifices that most of us will never fully understand. Think about the importance of truly seeing people, of noticing when someone might be in danger. And remember Ashley Henning, Master Sergeant, mother, friend, soldier, gone, but not forgotten. If you're still awake and listening, check whether you've left your little goodnight comment. I always check your comments before I sleep too. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Meanwhile, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight, we journey into a story that begins in the quiet mountain town of Athol, Idaho, where the snow-capped peaks meet dense forests, and where the bonds of trust can sometimes hide the darkest secrets. This is a story about Kendi Howard, a woman who brought light wherever she went, a woman who collected glass chickens, a woman who loved her family fiercely, and a woman whose life ended on a cold February night in 2021, in a way that would shock an entire community and expose the calculated mind of someone trained to protect and serve. Kendi Ann Wilkins was born on the 30th of April, 1972, in the small town of Orofino, Idaho. Her parents, Janie and Wendell Wilkins, raised her with her older brother Brian in the kind of tight-knit family where everyone looked out for each other. When Kendi was just 4 years old, the family moved to Lewiston, where she would spend her childhood running, dancing, and channeling her fierce competitive spirit into youth track meets. She was by all accounts a force of nature. Athletic, competitive, full of energy that couldn't be contained. As a teenager, she found work in the restaurant industry, becoming one of the original crew members when the pizza factory opened in her town. She was the kind of person who made friends easily, whose smile was infectious, whose laughter filled a room. After high school, Kendi welcomed her daughter Brooke with Jim Forsman. Motherhood suited her, but life had other plans, and sometime around 1992 she met Daniel Charles Howard. Everyone called him Dan. He was serving in the Marines then, a man who seemed strong and protective. They married, and Kendi welcomed a son, Wyatt. The young family eventually settled in Athol, Idaho, a town of just over 700 people nestled in the Idaho Panhandle. In Athol, Kendi became a beloved figure. She worked at Kootenai Health, where her coworkers adored her warmth and dedication. She became a 4-H leader, guiding young people through projects and life lessons. And then came the greatest joy of her later years, her granddaughter, Kenley, born to her daughter Brooke in 2012. She was the best grandmother, Brooke would later say. The two were inseparable. Kendi would take Kenley skiing. They'd get their nails done together. They'd spend entire days just being together, grandmother and granddaughter, building memories that would have to last a lifetime. Though no one knew it then, Kendi had a thing for glass chickens. She collected them obsessively, each one carefully chosen and displayed in her china hutch. It was a quirky collection, but it was hers. The chickens represented something about her personality, bright, cheerful, a little whimsical. She made every holiday an event, especially for Kensley. Halloween, Christmas, Easter. Every occasion became a production of love and excitement. Those who knew her described her as magnetic. She had a bubbly personality. She loved being outside, attending concerts with friends, visiting breweries. She loved life itself with an enthusiasm that made others feel more alive just being around her. She worked hard, played hard, and loved hard. But behind the warmth and the chickens and the holiday celebrations, there was a shadow growing, a marriage that had become something else entirely. Daniel Charles Howard had built a life around authority and control. He served in the Marines, where he learned discipline and earned decorations. After his military service, he joined the Idaho State Police, where he would spend nearly 20 years as a trooper. To the outside world, he was a man who had dedicated his life to service. He received honors. He saved lives. He coached kids and volunteered in the community. But there was another side to Dan Howard, a darker side that emerged slowly over the years of his marriage to Kendi. Brooke, who was just a toddler when her mother married Dan, grew up seeing both sides of her stepfather. She witnessed what she would later describe as physical, emotional, and financial abuse. Dan was controlling about money, checking bank account balances daily, berating Kendi for any purchase he hadn't approved. He would come up behind Kendi and grab her sides, telling her to stop eating so much, criticizing her body relentlessly until she felt profoundly insecure. Kendi tried everything to lose weight. Pills, diets, exercise. She even scheduled consultations for cosmetic surgeries, desperate to feel better about herself, desperate perhaps to feel worthy in her husband's eyes. She became a client of a psychiatric nurse practitioner who helped people struggling with compulsive overeating and was prescribed medications to help control her appetite. But control was Dan Howard's specialty, and control, it seemed, was slipping away from him. In 2011, while on duty as a state trooper, Dan Howard shot and killed a woman. The shooting was later ruled justified, but the trauma of it seemed to mark a turning point. Then sometime around 2013, Dan discovered that Kendi was having an affair with their neighbor in Athol, a man who happened to be his best friend. What followed was a campaign of terror. Dan confronted the man at his workplace, accusing him of the ultimate betrayal, becoming extremely agitated. But he didn't stop there. He began following the man in his police patrol vehicle. He stole the man's mail. He stole his guns. He poured syrup into the man's vehicles, and then one night he fired a gun at the man's house. In May of 2014, Dan Howard was charged with first-degree stalking, aggravated assault, malicious injury to property, grand theft, and other crimes. The charges stemmed not just from his harassment of his wife's alleged lover, but also from accusations that he had stolen ammunition from the Idaho State Police. He was suspended from the force. In November 2014, after 19 years of service, Dan Howard resigned from the Idaho State Police. At his sentencing in early 2015, he stood before a judge and said he was utterly ashamed. He claimed he would forever endeavor to correct these wrongs. The judge, noting the stress Dan had been under following the 2011 shooting and discovering his wife's affair, seemed sympathetic. He sentenced Dan to probation, 4 months in jail, and 600 hours of community service. But during the investigation, police had collected text messages from Dan Howard that painted a chilling picture. In 2013, he had sent messages to someone saying that the man was lucky he's still breathing. He wrote that he could understand why men kill their old ladies. 10 years later, those words would prove prophetic. By 2021, Dan Howard was no longer with the Idaho State Police. Instead, he worked in the Alaskan oil fields, spending 3 weeks at a time away from home. The marriage was crumbling. On the 28th of January, 2021, just 5 days before Kendi would die, she picked Dan up from the airport. During that car ride, she told him she wanted a divorce. She later described his reaction to a friend, Michelle Lampert, as having been not good. But Kendi was moving forward with her life. She had made an offer on a house in Kamaya, her childhood hometown, a place of happy memories. She was excited to move back, to start fresh. She had a job lined up. She was collecting references. She had even started talking about opening an antique store, something she'd dreamed about for years. And she had reconnected with a man she'd known since childhood, a high school sweetheart. They were together again, and for the first time in years, Kendi seemed genuinely happy. She was making plans. She had gone to get her nails done. She was scheduling appointments for a body transformation. She was looking forward. The divorce would mean splitting assets. The couple had accumulated approximately $2 million in shared property, including Dan's retirement benefits from his years with the state police. Kendi stood to receive nearly $1 million. But Dan Howard had discovered something that filled him with rage. His wife wasn't just leaving him. She was with someone else. On the 1st of February, 2021, Kendi's brother Brian and Dan took a 3-hour drive together to help Kendi's father with something. During that trip, Dan asked Brian if Kendi was having an affair. Brian confirmed it. Dan didn't sleep that night. Brian could hear him pacing. The drive home the next day was reckless, Dan driving with a fury that frightened Brian. And then 3 days before Kendi died, something terrifying happened. Kendi woke up in the middle of the night. Dan was standing over her in their bed. He was dressed entirely in black. He was wearing gloves, and according to what Kendi told her daughter, she believed he was holding a pillow in his hands. Kendi was terrified. She went to stay with her parents, telling them she was afraid for her life. But Dan made promises. He told her he loved her. He told her he wouldn't hurt her. He convinced her to come home. It was a fatal mistake. February 2nd, 2021, started like many other days. Kendi went to work at Kootenai Health, where her co-worker Matt Kulak saw her that afternoon. She was in good spirits. He would later testify. She talked about her plans to move to Kamaya, to take some time off, to start her new job. She was going to start over. She seemed genuinely excited about life. So notably, when Matt saw Kendi that day, she had no injuries, no burn on her arm, no visible bruises, nothing that would indicate anything was wrong. That evening, Kendi returned home to the house in Athol. A packed duffel bag sat at the bottom of the stairs, filled with women's clothing. Someone was planning to leave. Only Kendi and Dan were home that night. What happened in those hours between when she arrived home and when Dan called 911 would become the subject of intense investigation, expert testimony, and ultimately a murder trial. According to Dan's later statements to police, Kendi went upstairs to take a bath. He remained downstairs. He was filling out divorce paperwork, he said, having a few beers, watching television, doing laundry. He heard a thud, he claimed, but didn't investigate. Not for an hour and a half. Finally, he said he went upstairs. And there in the bathtub, he found his wife. She was naked. She was dead. There was a gunshot wound in her mouth. Her gun was submerged in the bathwater. At 10:43 p.m., Dan Howard called 911. The screaming began immediately. "She's in the bathtub dead," he screamed. "She shot herself." The call was dispatched as a suicide. Kootenai County Sheriff's Deputy Miranda Thomas was one of the first responders to arrive at the Howard home that cold February night. What she witnessed when she entered would stay with her. Dan Howard was screaming, yelling, asking for help. He was sobbing. He was gagging. He appeared to be freaking out completely. Deputy Thomas and the other officers watched this performance, but some of them noticed something odd. Despite all the crying, there were no tears. In the upstairs bathroom, they found Kendi Howard's body in the bathtub. She was nude. The water was still warm to the touch. Her hair had been pulled back with a clip, though some strands had escaped and fallen across her face. Her purse and phone sat neatly by the sink. A handgun was submerged in the water. But almost immediately, the responding officers felt something was off. Detective Jerry Northrup, who would become the lead investigator, arrived at the scene. He noticed broken glass in the primary bedroom. Kendi's clothing was thrown on the floor. Behind the bathroom door, there were wet towels. And then there was the laundry. The clothes dryer was running. Inside were clean bath towels and bathroom mats. When detectives checked the display, it showed 6 minutes remaining on the cycle. They determined that the dryer had been started within 1 minute of the 911 call. Who starts laundry after discovering their wife has just died? Deputy Thomas noticed other details. At the bottom of the stairs sat that packed duffel bag filled with women's clothing. The shirt Dan Howard was wearing appeared to have fresh deodorant stains, as if it had been changed recently. And then there was the positioning of Kendi's body. Lene Sabito, the chief deputy coroner for Kootenai County, photographed the scene meticulously. She noticed how strange the position looked, how abnormal. The flow of blood around Kendi's mouth and cheek didn't seem right. Some blood trails appeared to travel upward, against gravity. Lene Sabito would later say she was probably the first person who suspected that Kendi was already dead when she was shot. When Detective Kenneth Lelleton arrived at the scene and began interviewing Dan Howard, he noticed the former trooper's demeanor. Dan made little eye contact. He appeared frustrated rather than devastated. He told Lelleton about the marital problems, about the divorce proceedings. He suggested that Kendi might have wanted to die by suicide because she was upset about the house in Kamaya being included in the divorce property. Dan claimed he'd heard a thud while he was downstairs doing paperwork, but he waited nearly 2 hours before going to check on his wife. By the time he found her, he said she was cold to the touch, though the water was still warm. When police allowed Dan Howard to notify family members, Kendi's daughter Brooke answered the phone. Dan told her there had been an accident. He said Kendi had shot herself. But Brooke's immediate reaction, even through her shock and grief, was accusation. Investigators could hear her over the phone, crying and asking Dan what he had done, insisting that her mother would never shoot herself. Despite their suspicions, detectives didn't have enough evidence at the scene to arrest Dan Howard that night. He was allowed to go stay with family, but the investigation had only just begun. The body was sent to Spokane, Washington for autopsy. Dr. John Howard, the Spokane County medical examiner at the time, performed the examination. His initial findings were troubling from the investigation's perspective. He determined the cause of death was the gunshot wound, but he classified the manner of death as undetermined rather than suicide or homicide. But Dr. John Howard had missed things, critical things. Linnaeus Abito, the Kootenai County deputy coroner, saw Kendi's body again days later at a funeral home. This time, she noticed significant discoloration that hadn't been apparent the night of the death. Bruising that Dr. Howard hadn't documented. Injuries that told a different story entirely. When the autopsy report arrived in June 2021 at the Kootenai County Coroner's Office, they reviewed it carefully. The official cause of death remained undetermined, but the coroner's office wasn't convinced. The case would take 2 years to build. 2 long years of gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, consulting experts, and piecing together what really happened that night. As detectives dug deeper into the case, a horrifying picture began to emerge. Kendi Howard's body, when properly examined, told a story of violence. She had bruises all over her body. She had shallow cuts on her feet. She had a large second-degree burn on her forearm. A burn that hadn't been there when her coworker saw her earlier that day. And she had a broken jaw. Medical experts would later determine that Kendi had sustained these injuries in what appeared to be a violent struggle. But there was more. The blood spatter evidence didn't match a suicide. There was significantly less blood at the scene than investigators would expect from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the mouth. The trajectory of the bullet was wrong. When experts analyzed the angle, they determined that based on where the bullet entered and exited, Kendi could not have shot herself. The downward trajectory indicated someone else had pulled the trigger, with the gun positioned above her. And then there was the medical evidence that would prove crucial. Kendi Howard had likely died from asphyxiation before she was shot. Prosecutors would later argue that Dan Howard had killed his wife using a carotid restraint technique, a hold that cuts off blood flow to the brain. This was a technique Dan Howard would have learned during his basic training when he went through Idaho POS2 training. As a state trooper, it was a technique designed to subdue suspects, a technique that when used long enough could kill. Kendi had suffered for a while before she died. The asphyxiation came after a beating, after the struggle that left her bruised and burned and broken. And then, after she was dead, Dan Howard had staged the scene. According to prosecutors, he removed her clothes. He carried her body upstairs to the bathroom. He placed her in the tub and filled it with water. He pulled her hair back with that clip. He positioned her phone and purse by the sink, as if she'd brought them in herself. He placed the gun in her mouth and pulled the trigger, trying to make it look like she'd taken her own life. He started the dryer to wash the evidence, the towels that might have been used during the struggle or the cleanup. He changed his shirt, putting on fresh deodorant, and then he called 911, screaming and wailing and putting on a performance. But Dan Howard had made mistakes. Even with all his law enforcement training, even with his knowledge of crime scenes and evidence collection, he couldn't hide everything. The water was still warm. The dryer was still running. The blood patterns didn't match. The trajectory of the bullet was wrong. Kendi's injuries told the true story. Linnaeus Abito's careful documentation of the scene would prove invaluable. Her photographs, her notes about the positioning of the body, the blood flow, the strange details that didn't add up. These would become crucial evidence. In April 2023, more than 2 years after Kendi's death, Dan Howard was finally arrested and charged with first-degree murder and felony domestic battery. The domestic battery charge stemmed from an incident 7 months before Kendi's death, an incident where Kendi had photographed bruises on her body and sent them to her friend Michelle Lampert. Dan Howard pleaded not guilty. He was initially released on a $1.5 million property bond, required to wear an ankle monitor, and abide by an 11 p.m. curfew. He was prohibited from coming within 2 miles of the Spokane International Airport. The trial was set for March of 2024. The community watched, Kendi's family waited, and Dan Howard maintained his innocence. insisting that his wife had taken her own life. On March 4th, 2024, 3 years and 1 month after Kendi Howard's death, the trial of Dan Howard began in Coeur d'Alene. The courtroom was packed with Kendi's loved ones, law enforcement officers who had worked the case, and community members who had followed the story. Kootenai County Prosecutor Stanley Mortensen delivered the opening statement for the state. He laid out the evidence methodically. The fight that night over finances, the physical violence, the broken jaw, the carotid restraint, the staging of the scene. There were two sides to that coin. Mortensen told the jury, referring to Howard's background in law enforcement, having the ability to read a crime scene and collect evidence also gives the ability to stage a crime scene and not leave evidence. Mortensen explained that the state's case would show that Kendi Howard died of asphyxiation, not from the gunshot wound. That she was killed by her husband, who then went to elaborate lengths to make it appear she had died by suicide. That Dan Howard was guilty of murder. A defense attorney, Jason Johnson, countered with a different narrative. He argued that Kendi Howard had been suicidal, that she was living a double life, struggling with body image issues, drinking, and dealing with family conflict. He pointed out that Dan Howard's DNA was not found on the gun, only Kendi's DNA and another unidentified male sample. He argued there were no defensive marks on Dan, no DNA under Kendi's fingernails from a struggle. Johnson claimed the scene was consistent with suicide, that the medical examiner's initial assessment was correct, that the police had made up their minds early on and had twisted the evidence to fit their theory. The trial would last nearly 3 weeks and feature 62 witnesses. Brooke Wilkins took the stand, her voice thick with emotion as she described her mother as her best friend, as her daughter's best friend. She described Dan Howard as controlling and abusive, constantly criticizing Kendi's body, monitoring every penny spent. She testified about the terror in her mother's voice when Kendi described waking up to find Dan standing over her in black clothing just days before she died. Matt Kulak, Kendi's co-worker, testified that he'd seen Kendi at work the day she died, and she'd been in good spirits talking about her new life in Kamaya. Crucially, he testified that Kendi had no burn on her arm when he saw her, contradicting any suggestion that the injury had existed before the night of her death. Detective Eric Tolleson explained the carotid restraint technique to the jury, demonstrating how it would have been taught during Idaho State Police training. Captain Paul Berger testified that troopers, especially those in SWF, like Dan Howard, would have been very familiar with the sound of gunshots, particularly indoors. Medical experts testified about the injuries, the blood patterns, the trajectory of the bullet. They explained why the scene didn't match a suicide, why the physical evidence suggested Kendi had been dead before she was shot. Lenny Sabito's photographs and testimony proved critical in showing how the scene had been staged, how the positioning of the body was abnormal, how the blood flow didn't match the supposed cause of death. And then in a stunning twist midway through the trial, on Friday, March 15th, Dan Howard was arrested again. While out on bond, he had been spotted near the Spokane International Airport. Within the 2-mile radius, he was prohibited from entering. He claimed he was just helping a friend return a rental vehicle, but it didn't matter. His bond was revoked, and he was taken back into custody, where he would remain for the rest of the trial. The trial proceeded without the jury knowing about this arrest, but it would factor into sentencing later. After 10 days of testimony and 62 witnesses, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for just over 8 hours. On March 19, 2024, they returned with a verdict. Guilty of second-degree murder. Guilty of domestic battery. Kendi's family wept, some with relief, some with grief. Brooke Wilkins would later say, "I cried. It's such a relief that people got to hear what actually happened." Prosecutor Julia Schofstall said, "To me, this case was about a man who thought that he could control a woman, and if he couldn't get his way, he was going to force it." Dan Howard was taken into custody immediately. Sentencing was scheduled for May. But the horror of what Dan Howard had done didn't end with Kendi's murder. In the months and years that followed, his treatment of her family added another layer of cruelty. Dan Howard had drained money from Kendi's bank account. He turned off her cell phone plan and her daughter's cell phone plan. And then on what would have been Kendi's birthday, the first birthday after her death, Dan Howard held a yard sale Everything Kendi loved was spread out on the driveway. Her belongings, her treasures, her collection of glass chickens, the ones she had promised to her granddaughter Kenley, all of it for sale. Brooke Wilkins arrived at the house, hoping to buy anything that had meant something to her mother, anything she could keep as a reminder. But when Dan saw her, he called 911. He had his stepdaughter, the daughter he'd raised since she was an infant, trespassed from her childhood home. It was one of the last things he could do without physically hurting me, Brooke would later say. There were no attempts to contact Brooke after the night of her mother's death. No call to console his stepdaughter. No acknowledgement of her grief. The man who had raised her simply cut her off and sold her mother's belongings on her birthday, May 23rd, 2024. The courtroom in Coeur d'Alene was once again packed. This time it was for sentencing. Dan Howard had been in jail since his arrest at the airport in March. Court records indicated he had gone on a hunger strike, losing at least 50 pounds. He was weakened, and there were reports he had used a wheelchair at a recent hearing, though he entered the courtroom under his own power for sentencing, wearing a red and white striped jumpsuit. Kendi's loved ones filled the courtroom. Some of Dan's supporters were also present, people who had known him from his days in law enforcement and community service. Brooke Wilkins addressed the court, her voice steady as she looked directly at the man who had raised her. "You'll never understand the damage you have caused to all of us," she said. "You are not the victim. You deserve to be here today. You deserve to never again live a free life." She spoke about what her mother would miss. She wouldn't see Brooke get married. She wouldn't see her granddaughter Kenley grow up. She didn't get to see Brooke finally get her life together. She described the guilt she carried, wondering if she could have convinced her mother to stay away from the house that final night. The fear in her mother's voice when she described waking up to find Dan standing over her would never leave Brooke. Kendi's parents, Jamie and Wendell Wilkins, sat in the courtroom with their grief palpable. Their daughter, who had brought so much joy to their lives, who had loved holidays and family gatherings, who had been excited about her new chapter, was gone, and the man who had killed her was the man they had welcomed into their family. Then it was Dan Howard's turn to speak. He stood before the judge and professed his innocence. He said he loved and missed his wife. He still loved Kendi's family. He claimed he asked the judge to consider his service as a Marine and as an Idaho State Police trooper, his 20 years of distinguished service, the lives he'd saved, the honors he'd received. He talked about his years coaching kids, his involvement in 4-H, his volunteer work in the community. "I'm not that monster people have portrayed me to be," he said. "I stand before you a shell of the man I used to be. Hell, I don't even have a shell left. My wife took her life, and she took my will to live." Kendi's family members in the gallery shook their heads at every word. They had heard enough of his lies. Prosecutor Art Verheeren addressed the court, describing Kendi's injuries in detail. The bruises all over her body, the shallow cuts on her feet, the second-degree burn, the broken jaw. He described how Dan Howard had killed Kendi by putting her in a carotid restraint, how she had suffered for a while before she died, how that suffering came after a beating. Verheeren described how Dan had then removed her clothes, carried her body to the bathroom, placed her in the tub, filled it with water, and shot her through the mouth to stage a suicide. He pointed out that Dan Howard's actions mirrored his behavior from 10 years earlier, when he had threatened to kill the man who had allegedly had an affair with Kendi, when he had stalked that man, stolen his mail, damaged his property, and fired a gun at his house. Then 1st District Judge Lamont Barrett spoke. He addressed Dan Howard directly. "Despite your efforts at the time to appear emotional, sad, and distraught, it's clear to me that you're a remorseless killer, and I don't say that lightly," Barrett said. The judge noted the text messages from 2013, where Dan had written that he could understand why men kill their old ladies. He said it was worth noting that Dan had discussed killing wives, and then 10 years later he did it. Barrett described the motivation, a combination of jealousy, greed, pride, anger, and revenge. He said many people experience the aftershocks of infidelity and divorce, but not everyone's reaction is murder. "You didn't just kill Kendi," Barrett told Howard. "You killed a mother. You killed a grandmother. You killed a sister. You killed a daughter. You killed a coworker. You killed somebody who brought a lot of life and light to those around her. You snuffed that out because of your own pride and greed." The judge said it was clear that Dan Howard showed little possibility of rehabilitation. Based on his history, Based on the heinous nature of the crime, society needed to be protected from Dan Howard. Kendi's family deserved closure. There is absolutely no justification for murdering your wife. And I think it's important the sentence sends that message. Barrett said, "It's an outrageously egregious murder. All murder is. But this is particularly heinous in my view. It's clear to me that you're a remorseless killer." Judge Barrett sentenced Dan Howard to life in prison without the possibility of parole for second-degree murder. He also received 10 years for domestic battery, to be served concurrently with the life sentence. Dan Howard, age 58, would die in prison. Sheriff Bob Norris issued a statement. Dan Howard tortured and murdered his wife. He has forfeited his right to live in a civilized society. Society is a safe place knowing he will die in prison. Prosecutor Stanley Mortensen said, "No parole. Dan Howard is going to die in prison." Outside the courthouse, Janie Wilkins, Kendi's mother, spoke to reporters. When asked about Dan's claims that he loved Kendi and her family, she was blunt. "He was only speaking for himself. He's just a liar." Kendi got the last laugh, and he finally got what he deserved. Today, Kendi Howard's memory lives on through her family. Her daughter Brooke has found love and is engaged to Sean Crowley. She's raising her daughter Kenley, who is now 12 years old and keeps her grandmother's memory alive. Some of Kendi's glass chickens survived. Brooke managed to save a few from the yard sale, and Kenley treasures them when she looks at them, and she sees all the different colors her grandmother collected. She feels a connection to the woman who loved her so much, who took her skiing and to get their nails done, who made every day an adventure. Brooke says her mother never let anything get her down, and she tries to keep that same positive outlook. Nothing will fill the hole he created, and nothing can fix or undo what he has done, Brooke said. But her name can be free. The thought that he can no longer have control over her name, her memory, and her spirit gives me a sense of peace. In February 2025, the Kootenai County Prosecuting Attorney's Office received the Outstanding Victim Services Award for 2024 from the Idaho Victim Witness Association. The award recognized the work of county prosecutors in what was called a complex and heartbreaking legal battle in the Howard case. Tens of thousands of people from across the country and around the world watched the 2-week murder trial unfold live online. The case drew attention not just because of its shocking nature, but because of the questions it raised about domestic violence, about control, about how someone trained to protect and serve could use that training to commit murder. The prosecutors highlighted what Kendi was planning for at the time of her death. She had made an offer on a house in Kamaya. She had a job lined up. She was scheduling a body transformation. She had gone to get her nails done the day she died. She was excitedly telling friends about starting an antique store, a dream she'd held for years. She wanted to just love life. Her friend Michelle Lampert said, and she loved life. These were not the actions of someone planning suicide. These were the actions of a woman looking forward, planning her future, excited about the possibilities ahead of her. Dan Howard took all of that away. He took away the mother, the grandmother, the sister, the daughter, the friend, the co-worker who brought light to everyone around her. He took away all the moments Kendi would never have. The wedding she wouldn't attend, the granddaughter she wouldn't watch grow up, the antique store she would never open, the life in Kamaya she would never live. Kendi Howard was 48 years old when she was murdered. She should have had decades ahead of her, decades of watching Kinsey grow up, decades of enjoying her newfound freedom and happiness, decades of collecting more glass chickens. Instead, she became a cautionary tale, a reminder that domestic violence can hide behind a badge and a uniform, that control can masquerade as love, that sometimes the person who vowed to protect you can become the greatest danger you face. But Kendi's story is also about resilience, about a daughter who fought for justice for her mother, about investigators who wouldn't give up even when the medical examiner's initial ruling suggested suicide, about prosecutors who spent 2 years building a case to ensure the truth came out, about a community that rallied around Kendi's memory and demanded accountability. Dan Howard is now serving his life sentence at the Idaho State Correctional Institution in Boise. He will never walk free again. He will never harm another person. As a former law enforcement officer, his time in prison will not be easy. As Prosecutor Mortensen said, "It's not easy going to prison as a former law enforcement officer." But Brooke Wilkins has found a measure of peace in knowing that her stepfather no longer controls her mother's memory. Kendi's name is Free. Her spirit lives on in every glass chicken that survived, in every memory that Kinley holds dear, in every story that's told about the woman who loved life so fiercely. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Tonight we'll journey into a case that spans more than 3 decades. A story of tragedy, relentless determination, and ultimately justice. This is the story of Robin Cornell and Lisa Story. Let me take you back to Cape Coral, Florida, a quiet coastal community where the warmth of the sun meets the gentle rhythm of everyday life. It's a place where neighbors know each other, where children play outdoors, and where people feel safe in their homes. But on one night in 1990, that sense of safety would be shattered forever. So let your breathing slow and allow me to tell you this story. The year was 1990, and Cape Coral was growing steadily as a community. Among its residents was Jan Cornell, a hardworking single mother who worked at Cape Coral Hospital. Jan was devoted to her 11-year-old daughter, Rob, a bright, energetic 5th grader who loved to jump rope, play outdoors, and spend time with her friends. Robin was the kind of child who brought light into every room she entered. She had that special quality, that innocence and joy that all children possess before the world shows them its darker sides. Jan treasured every moment with her daughter, working hard to provide for them both, always making sure Robin felt loved and safe. In early May of 1990, Jan made a decision that seemed perfectly ordinary at the time. She needed a roommate to help with expenses, and a co-worker at the hospital, 32-year-old Lisa Story, needed a place to stay. Lisa was an international student, a photographer, a motorcyclist, someone with an adventurous spirit and a kind heart. The arrangement seemed perfect. Lisa moved into the apartment at the courtyards of Cape Coral condominiums on Southeast 12th Avenue on May 9, 1990. It was just the beginning of what should have been a positive new chapter for both women. Lisa had recently become engaged to a man named Randy Richards, and she had just purchased a 1990 Seiko wristwatch as a birthday gift for him. The watch was engraved with words of love. To Randy, happy birthday, 5/11/90, all my love, Lisa. That evening, that ordinary Wednesday evening, Jan had plans to visit her boyfriend. She would watch a late-night talk show at his place, something she'd done many times before. Lisa, having just moved in that very day, kindly agreed to watch Robin while Jan was out. Before she left, Jan said goodnight to her daughter. Those final words would echo in her mind for decades to come. Good night. I'm going to Donnie's. I love you. Robin settled in for the evening, likely excited about the weekend ahead, about jump rope and playing with friends. Lisa settled into her new room, perhaps thinking about her fiancé, about the watch she'd give him for his birthday, about the new life beginning to unfold before her. Neither of them knew that someone was watching. Neither of them knew that before the night ended, their lives would be stolen away in an act of unspeakable cruelty. The hours passed quietly. Jen fell asleep on her boyfriend's couch while watching television. When she woke around 4 in the morning on May 10th, she realized she needed to get home quickly. Her shift at the hospital started in just 30 minutes. She drove through the quiet, dark streets of Cape Coral, probably thinking about the day ahead, about getting ready for work, about checking on Robin before she left. The morning air was still cool, the world not yet awake. When Jan arrived at her apartment, something immediately felt wrong. Both locks on the front door were bolted. She had specifically asked Lisa not to use the bottom lock because Jan only had a key to the top one. Her heart began to beat faster as she unlocked the top bolt and pushed open the door. Inside, the apartment was too quiet. That heavy, oppressive kind of silence that speaks of something terrible. And then Jan heard it. Footsteps. Someone was inside. Her breathing quickened. Something was very, very wrong. She stepped inside and saw something that made no sense. An ironing board had been set up in the living room, and on it, photographs of Robin had been carefully arranged, laid out, displayed. It was such a bizarre, disturbing sight that Jan's mind struggled to process what she was seeing. Then she heard more sounds from upstairs. Her maternal instincts took over, and she ran up the stairs, screaming Robin's name. The silence that greeted her was deafening. She rushed to her own bedroom first, and found Lisa. Lisa's body lay on the bed, lifeless and cold. John's world began to tilt, to spin, but she forced herself to keep moving. She had to find Robin. She had to find her daughter. She ran to Robin's room, and there, on the floor, she found her baby girl. Robin's nightgown had been pulled up around her neck. Her body was cold to the touch. Rigor mortis had already begun to set in. Jan called 911, her hands shaking, her voice breaking. She tried to revive Robin, tried CPR, even though she knew her daughter was gone. "We believe in God," she would later say. "Why can't we have a miracle?" But there would be no miracle that morning. When the Cape Coral police arrived at the scene, they found a horror that would haunt investigators for more than 3 decades. Both victims had been sexually assaulted and suffocated with pillows. The attacks had occurred while they slept, giving them no chance to defend themselves or escape. The crime scene told a story of calculated cruelty. The killer had entered through an unlocked sliding glass door at the back of the apartment. He had moved through the home with purpose, attacking Lisa first in her bedroom, then moving to Robin's room where he assaulted and murdered the 11-year-old child. The suffocation had been prolonged. Investigators estimated that each victim had been deprived of oxygen for 3 to 4 agonizing minutes. The killer had held the pillows down, pressing them over their faces, as they struggled and fought for breath that would never come. After the murders, the killer had taken his time. He moved through the apartment, stealing items, Lisa's driver's license, her credit cards, her checkbook, and the engraved watch she'd bought for her fiancé. The one that said, "All my love, Lisa." He also took Robin's photographs and arranged them on the ironing board, in what investigators could only interpret as a final twisted display of power. The killer left behind evidence, though. Biological evidence, DNA. Semen samples were found on bed sheets, on Robin's pillowcase, and on Robin herself. There was also a hair found on Lisa's body. In 1990, DNA technology was still relatively new, but investigators carefully preserved every piece of evidence, hoping that someday, somehow, it would lead them to the killer. The community of Cape Coral was devastated. Parents held their children closer. Doors that had been left unlocked were now bolted shut. The sense of safety that had defined this quiet coastal town had been destroyed in a single night. Jan Cornell made a promise at her daughter's grave, a promise that would define the rest of her life. She promised Robin that as long as she drew breath, she would never stop looking for whoever had done this. She would never let the case go cold. She would never let Robin and Lisa be forgotten. "I loved her with all my heart and soul," Jan said, "and someone hurt her. They terrified her to her death, and I made her a promise when I had to say goodbye. As long as I'm alive, I'll keep looking." The investigation moved forward with intensity. Hundreds of suspects were interviewed. Dozens of DNA samples were collected and tested. The case appeared on America's Most Wanted, not once, not twice, but 3 times. The most recent appearance coming in 2010, a full 20 years after the murders. Billboards were erected. Tips came in. Detectives followed every lead, no matter how small. The case was passed from one investigator to another, as years turned into decades. But it never went cold. The Cape Coral Police Department never gave up, and Jan Cornell never stopped advocating for justice. Every weekend, Jan visited Robin's grave and placed fresh flowers there. Every anniversary of the murders, she spoke to the media, keeping the case in the public eye. Every day she carried the weight of that terrible morning, the image of her daughter's body, the knowledge that she hadn't been there to protect her. The years stretched on. 1990 became 2000. 2000 became 2010. Robin would have graduated high school, gone to college, perhaps married and had children of her own. Lisa's fiancé, Randy Richards, never forgot the woman he loved, the woman who had been taken from him just as their life together was beginning. The DNA evidence sat in a database, waiting. The killer's genetic signature was on file, waiting to be matched, but year after year, no match came. The killer was out there, somewhere, living his life while the families of his victims lived with unbearable grief. Detective Christy Jo Ellis worked the case alongside Detective Kurt Grau, both refusing to let it fade away. We have the killer's DNA, Detective Grau said in 2010. It's just a matter of getting the right person. But getting the right person seemed increasingly unlikely as time wore on. How do you find someone when you don't know who they are? How do you bring justice when the killer could be anyone? And then, after 26 years, everything changed. August 27th, 2016. A man named Joseph Adam Zeeler was arrested in Lee County, Florida, for shooting his own son with a pellet gun during an argument. It was a domestic violence incident, a felony battery charge, the kind of case that happens every day in communities across America. But this arrest would prove to be anything but ordinary. Under a law passed in Florida in 2009, anyone arrested for a felony is required to provide a DNA sample. These samples are entered into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a national database that compares DNA from arrestees to DNA from unsolved crimes. Joseph Zeeler's DNA was collected and entered into the system. Within days, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement made a connection that would change everything. Zeeler's DNA matched the DNA recovered from the Cape Coral crime scene in 1990. The match wasn't close, it wasn't probable. It was certain. The chances of the DNA being anyone but Joseph Zeeler were 1 in 700 billion. In fact, the number was even higher. But the Florida Department of Law Enforcement stopped calculating at 700 billion because, as they said, the human mind can't fathom a number bigger than that. When Detective Christy Jo Ellis received the phone call about the DNA match, she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Are you kidding me?" she said, her voice filled with disbelief and hope. After a quarter-century of police work, after countless dead ends and dashed hopes, the case was finally breaking open. Cape Coral Police Chief David Newland held a press conference on September 28, 2016. Standing before the media, with John Cornell beside him, he spoke two simple words that carried the weight of 26 years of grief and determination. "We got him." Joseph Zeeler was 54 years old at the time of his arrest. He had been living in North Fort Myers, just a short drive from Cape Coral, for 20 years at the same address. He had been there all along, living in the same community where he had committed his horrific crimes. Seeing the yearly updates about the case, the billboards seeking information, the pleas from Jan Cornell for anyone with knowledge to come forward. For Jan Cornell, the arrest felt like winning the lottery of justice. Every prayer she had whispered at Robin's grave, every promise she had made, every tear she had shed, they had all led to this moment. "I cannot be more grateful today," she said at the press conference, her voice shaking with emotion. "I cannot be more happy. I want my daughter and my friend to finally rest in peace, because their day for justice is right here." Joseph Zeeler was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of sexual battery, and 1 count of burglary with assaults. The case that would finally go to trial in May of 2023, 33 years after the murders took place. During those years awaiting trial, Zeeler filed numerous motions on his own behalf, trying to halt the proceedings, trying to prevent the case from moving forward. But the wheels of justice, though they had turned slowly, would not be stopped now. When the trial finally began, the prosecution presented a case built on overwhelming scientific evidence. The DNA match was irrefutable. Forensic experts testified about the biological evidence found at the scene. Crime scene technicians walked the jury through photographs of that terrible night. Former detectives shared their decades of work on the case. The state presented 4 aggravating factors: that the murders were cold, calculated, and premeditated, that they were committed during the commission of a sexual battery, that they were committed during a burglary, and that they were committed in a heinous, atrocious, and cruel manner. Zeeler's defense team argued that he had no motive for the murders. They suggested that the attack must have been personal, that someone must have had a grudge against Jan Cornell herself. But the evidence was too strong. The DNA didn't lie, and then Zeeler took the stand in his own defense, a decision that his attorneys would later say didn't help his case. During his testimony, Zeeler stunned the courtroom by claiming he had slept with John Cornell a few months before the murders. "I thought the only way my DNA could have got there was from me sleeping with John Cornell," he said, a claim John would vehemently deny. Zeeler's behavior on the stand was erratic and disturbing. He screamed at the jury. He made vulgar gestures. He raised his middle finger to the cameras. The mask of normalcy that he had maintained for decades slipped away, revealing something darker underneath. Jan Cornell sat through every moment of the trial, facing the man who had murdered her daughter and her friend. She listened to the gruesome details of how they died. She looked at photographs she had never wanted to see. She carried herself with dignity and strength, knowing that Robin and Lisa were counting on her to see this through to the end. On May 18, 2023, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty on all counts. Joseph Zieler was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Robin Cornell and Lisa Story. But the trial wasn't over. Florida law required a separate penalty phase to determine whether Zieler would receive the death penalty or life in prison. The penalty phase began shortly after the guilty verdict. The jury heard arguments from both sides about whether Joseph Zieler should live or die for his crimes. The prosecution painted a picture of the victim's final moments. They asked the jury to imagine what 11-year-old Robin must have been thinking as she was attacked. "Where's my mommy? Where's Lisa? Why is this man touching me? I can't breathe." They described the 3 to 4 minutes of suffocation, the terror, the pain, the desperation for air that would never come. The defense presented mitigating factors, arguing that Zieler's life should be spared despite his crimes. But the weight of what he had done was too great. After approximately 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their recommendation. Under a new Florida law that had been signed just weeks earlier, only 8 out of 12 jurors needed to recommend death for the sentence to be considered. The jury voted 10-2 in favor of the death penalty. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for June 26, 2023, a Spencer hearing where both sides could present additional evidence and arguments before the judge made the final decision. That hearing would prove to be even more dramatic than anyone expected. Joseph Zieler was brought into the courtroom with his wrist shackled. As the proceedings were about to begin, he called over his attorney, Kevin Shirley. Shirley leaned forward, assuming Zieler wanted to whisper something to him. Instead, Zieler swung his elbow up and struck his attorney in the face. Bailiffs immediately tackled Zieler to the ground and removed him from the courtroom. Shirley, stunned but not seriously injured, later explained what happened. "It seemed like he didn't want our conversation to be picked up by the microphones. So he waved me down and I bent over and he struck me." Even in the final moments, Zieler was demonstrating the violence and unpredictability that had marked his crimes 33 years earlier. Judge Robert Branning proceeded with the hearing, and then announced his decision. Looking directly at Joseph Zieler, the judge spoke words that Jan Cornell had waited decades to hear. The court concludes that under the laws of the state of Florida, the defendant has forfeited his right to live. Joseph Zieler was sentenced to death, 2 death sentences, 1 for each of his victims. Outside the courthouse, State Attorney Amira Fox stood with Jan Cornell for a press conference. Photographs of Robin and Lisa were displayed beside them, young faces frozen in time forever, 11 and 32. Jan spoke to the gathered media, her voice steady despite the emotion she must have been feeling. "Nothing can take the place of hearing the words today. That justice for Robin and justice for Lisa has happened," she said. "He has received the ultimate punishment that the state of Florida can give. He will never see a free moment. He will never hurt another individual on this earth. For that, I could not be more grateful." She spoke about her daughter and Lisa, about the lives that had been cut so short. They were here. They lived, some evil monster cut their lives so short, so unfair. But now they have peace, and now we can let them have peace. Randy Richards, Lisa's fiancé, also spoke that day. For 33 years he had carried the grief of losing the woman he loved, the woman who had bought him a birthday watch he would never receive. He thanked everyone who had worked on the case, everyone who had refused to give up. The Cape Coral Police Department received praise for their persistence. Police Chief Anthony Sizemore spoke about the nearly dozen detectives and forensic personnel who had worked the case over the years. "It consumed their career," he said. "It consumed a good part of their personal life, and even into their retirement life." State Attorney Amira Fox, who had been a young prosecutor when the murders occurred and had followed the case throughout her career, felt a sense of completion. "I hope the verdict and sentence recommendation have finally brought some sense of justice and closure to the families of Lisa Story and Robin Cornell," she said. Joseph Zieler was transferred to Florida's death row, where he remains today. He has maintained his innocence, filing appeals and claiming, "I have nothing to do with this," but the evidence speaks for itself. The DNA doesn't lie, and the families of Robin Cornell and Lisa Story finally have the justice they have sought for so long. This case reminds us of many things. It reminds us that justice, though it may be delayed, can still arrive. It reminds us of the dedication of law enforcement officers who refuse to let cases go cold, who pass investigations from one generation to the next, determined to find answers. It reminds us of the power of advances in technology, how a law requiring DNA samples from felony arrestees, passed in 2009, would eventually solve a murder from 1990. It reminds us that criminals can never truly rest, can never truly be safe from the consequences of their actions. But most of all, this case reminds us of a mother's love, of Jan Cornell's unwavering commitment to her daughter, her refusal to let Robin be forgotten, her determination to keep a promise made at a graveside so many years ago. For 33 years, Jan visited Robin's grave every weekend, with fresh flowers. For 33 years, she spoke Robin's name in interviews, kept the case in the public eye, advocated for justice, and in the end, she succeeded. She kept her promise. Robin Cornell was 11 years old when she died. She loved to jump rope. She loved to play outdoors. She was in the 5th grade, full of life and possibility. Lisa Story was 32, engaged to be married, with dreams of a future that would never come to pass. They deserved better than the violence that took them. They deserved to live full lives, to experience joy and love, to grow old surrounded by family and friends. That was stolen from them on a night in May of 1990. But they were not forgotten. And in the end, through the dedication of investigators, the march of technology, and a mother's unbreakable promise, justice was served. Let that be what you remember as you drift off to sleep tonight. Not the darkness of the crime, but the light of persistence, of love, of justice finally found. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight we're going to explore a story that unfolded in the quiet suburbs of Michigan, in a place where luxury homes line peaceful streets, and where neighbors wave to each other on morning jogs. It's a story about family, about secrets, and about the darkness that can hide behind closed doors. It was the morning of August 21st, 2017, in Farmington Hills, Michigan. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. In a sprawling mansion on Howard Road, a 10,000 square foot home with pristine white walls and manicured lawns, something was terribly wrong. 14-year-old Aya Altantawi woke that morning, expecting to see her mother as she did every day. Nada Harania was a creature of habit, a woman who thrived on routine. She would wake early, prepare breakfast for her children, and begin her day with energy and purpose. But that morning, Nada was nowhere to be found. Aya moved through the quiet house, her footsteps echoing on polished floors. She called for her mother. No answer. She checked the kitchen, the living room, her mother's bedroom. Empty. A strange feeling began to settle over her, something cold and uncertain. Then she noticed it. An open window in the guest bedroom on the 2nd floor, a window that should have been closed. She approached slowly, and when she looked outside, her world shattered in an instant. There, on the patio below, lay her mother, motionless, face up, still wearing her pajamas. Aya's scream pierced the morning silence. She ran, her feet barely touching the stairs as she raced to the phone. Her hands shook as she dialed 911. "We need an ambulance," she cried into the phone. "Oh my God. Please." The emergency operator tried to keep her calm, tried to get information, but Aya's voice was breaking, fragmenting with each word. She ran outside to her mother, hoping against hope that somehow this wasn't real, that her mother would wake up, that everything would be okay. But Nada Harania was gone. To understand what happened that morning, we need to go back to who Nada was, and the life she had been trying to build. Nada Harania was 35 years old, a woman with dark eyes that sparkled when she smiled, which was often. She was petite, standing barely over 5 feet tall, but she radiated energy. Her friends at the Franklin Athletic Club in Southfield would tell you she was impossible to miss. She would arrive each morning with a smile that could light up a room, ready to teach her fitness classes, ready to help others become the best versions of themselves. She specialized in weight loss, balance training, muscle toning. She was certified, professional, and deeply passionate about her work. But more than that, she was kind. She remembered details about her clients' lives. She asked about their families, their struggles, their victories. She made people feel seen. One of her workout partners, a woman named Gail, would later say that Nada was more than just a personal trainer. She was a loving mother to 3 young children, a devoted friend to many. She came to the gym every single day with that same bright smile. But behind that smile, Nada carried weight that had nothing to do with the dumbbells and resistance bands at the gym. She carried the weight of a marriage that had crumbled, of a divorce that had torn her family apart, of a fight for independence that some members of her family could not accept. Nada had been married to Dr. Basil Al-Tantawi for nearly 20 years. They had 3 children together: Muhammad, the eldest son, and 2 daughters, Aya and a younger sister. By all accounts, theirs had been a traditional family, rooted in Syrian and Islamic culture. Basil was a successful internal medicine physician, running an urgent care clinic in Canton. They lived in that magnificent home in Farmington Hills, a symbol of the American dream realized. But beneath that polished exterior, cracks had been forming for years. On Valentine's Day in 2016, those cracks split wide open. During an argument, Basil pushed Nada down a flight of stairs in their home. Their daughter Aya witnessed it, watched her father try to close a door on her mother, crushing Nada's hand in the process. Aya called the police. Basil was arrested and charged with domestic violence. The damage was done, not just to Nada's hand or her body, but to whatever remained of their marriage. The following month, Nada filed for divorce. The court issued a restraining order, barring Basil from the family home. He was required to wear an electronic tether to monitor his movements. For Nada, the divorce wasn't just about leaving an abusive marriage. It was about reclaiming herself. She had spent years conforming to expectations, to traditions that felt increasingly suffocating. Now, she wanted to live on her own terms. She got the job at the Franklin Athletic Club. She started working outside the home, something that had been a source of heated arguments. She stopped wearing the traditional hijab. She wore athletic clothes that fit close to her body, practical for her work. She even began casually dating a fellow trainer from the gym. To Nada, these changes represented freedom. To some members of her family, they represented betrayal. Muhammad Al-Tantawi was 16 years old in 2017. Born on June 7, 2001. He was the eldest child and only son. In traditional Arab culture, being the eldest son carries weight, carries expectation. Muhammad had always been close to his father. Very, very close. According to testimony that would later emerge in court, when his parents' marriage fell apart, when his father was forced to leave the family home, Muhammad didn't waver in his loyalty. He blamed his mother. In his view, Nada was destroying the family. She was taking his father's money, his father's house, his father's dignity. She was, as he saw it, not being a good Muslim. She was becoming too Americanized. She was defying traditions that should have been sacred. After Basil moved out, Muhammad visited his father at least twice a week. They talked on the phone constantly. In Muhammad's mind, with his father gone, he became the man of the house, and as such, his mother should respect his authority. But Nada wouldn't bend. She had spent too many years bending, accommodating, shrinking herself to fit into spaces that were too small for her spirit. Now she was done. The tension in the house grew thick. Muhammad became verbally abusive toward his mother. Sometimes physically abusive too, according to his sister Aya's later testimony. He would tell Nada to call off the divorce. She refused. Arguments erupted frequently, heated and bitter. Aya would remember her brother calling their mother a dog in his phone contacts. She would remember him saying Nada wasn't a good Muslim, that she was ruining everything. 2 weeks before her death, Nada told Muhammad that she was going to send him to live with his father. She had reached her limit. Muhammad's response was chilling. "You are going to get what's coming to you," he said. While this drama played out in the Farmington Hills mansion, Basil Al-Tantawi was facing his own reckoning. In 2016, the same year as the Valentine's Day incident, Basil was charged by the Michigan State Attorney General with Medicare fraud. His urgent care clinic in Canton had been billing for services not rendered, engaging in schemes that defrauded the healthcare system. In January of 2017, Bissell entered a guilty plea to Medicaid fraud and 2 counts of healthcare fraud, all felonies. He avoided prison time, but his physician's license was suspended in February of that year. He was ordered to pay nearly $280,000 in restitution. The man who had once earned more than $350,000 a year was now unable to work as a physician, unable to support his family in what the divorce filings called their lavish lifestyle. And not a new things. Things about the fraud. Things that could potentially send Bassel to prison for even longer if they came to light. According to text messages that would later be discovered, Nada had told someone she possessed information that could land her estranged husband in prison for financial crimes. The deposition was scheduled for August 23, 2017. Nada was expected to testify about what she knew. She never made it to that deposition. When Farmington Hills police officer Nathan Jordan arrived at the Howard Road mansion that morning, he was a 12-year veteran of the force. He had seen accident scenes before. This one didn't sit right. Nada Hirania lay on the patio, face up, in her pajamas. Above her, an open second-story window. Just inside that window, a 3-step ladder stood perfectly upright. On the top step of the ladder sat a bottle of Tilex cleaning spray. Nearby, there were streaks on the window, as if someone had been cleaning it. The scene told a story. Woman wakes early to clean windows, climbs ladder, loses balance, falls to her death. A tragic accident, but Officer Jordan's instincts were screaming that something was wrong. First, there was how she had landed. When someone falls from a window, their body typically shows certain patterns of impact, certain trajectories. This didn't match. Second, there was no blood. Not on the patio where she lay. Not on Officer Jordan's hands after he checked under her head for injuries. For someone who had supposedly just fallen 20 to 30 feet, striking a stucco ledge on the way down. Hair was stuck to that ledge, clearly indicating her head had hit it. There should have been blood. Third, that ladder. It was still standing perfectly upright. If Nada had truly fallen off it, wouldn't it have been knocked over? And then there was something else. A damp cloth lying near the body. When the paramedic Daniel Travorsky picked it up, he noticed it had a chemical smell. Officer Jordan began asking questions. He spoke to the children, Muhammad, 16, Aya, 14, and their younger sister, 12. They told him they hadn't moved the body. They said they had no idea what happened. Jordan radioed for detectives. This wasn't an accident. This was a murder scene. The investigation moved quickly. Detectives processed the scene, photographing every detail, collecting evidence. The guest bedroom where the open window was located was usually where Nada did her makeup in the mornings. The ladder, the Tilex, the positioning of everything. It all seemed too neat, too staged. They called in Dr. Lubisa Dragovic, the Oakland County Chief Medical Examiner. Dragovic had performed thousands of autopsies in his career. He had seen every kind of death imaginable. When he first examined Nada's body, the findings didn't add up. For someone who had fallen from a second-story window, the injuries were wrong. Yes, she had a blunt force injury to her head, consistent with hitting the stucco ledge. But the cause of death wasn't the fall. Nada Hirania had been asphyxiated, smothered, likely with that damp cloth that paramedics had found near her body. An analysis of her lungs showed evidence of what Dragovic called nasal oral blockage. Someone had placed something over her face, cutting off her air supply, holding it there until she stopped breathing. She was dead before she went out that window. The detectives returned to the house, looking for answers. The family had a 6-camera home security system. The cameras had been recording. When investigators reviewed the footage, they found something remarkable. The video showed shadows moving across the lawn in the pre-dawn hours. Shadows cast by someone moving inside the house. Near that second-story window, the investigators watched as lights flickered on and off. They watched as shapes moved, as something large was hoisted toward the window opening. At 5:55 in the morning, before Aya had called 911, the shadows showed someone pushing what appeared to be a body through the window. Dr. Dragovic would later tell a jury, "This video is telling 100,000 words." The security footage showed something else crucial. In the 24 hours before Nada's death, only 4 people had entered or left the house. Nada herself, Muhammad, Aya, and their younger sister. No intruders, no strangers, no mysterious killers from outside the family. Basil Altantawi, as investigators quickly confirmed through his court-ordered GPS tether, had been in Canton miles away. He had never approached the house. His electronic monitoring data was clear and conclusive. That left one person, one male in the house that morning. Muhammad. Detective Robert Garrick of the Farmington Hills Police Department extracted data from Muhammad's iPhone. What he found painted a disturbing picture. Beginning about 2 hours before Nada's body was discovered, there was a rapid succession of calls between Muhammad's phone and his father's phone, dozens of them. Many lasted only a handful of seconds. Some showed 0 minutes of connection, just brief attempts at contact. One call from Basil's phone to Muhammad's was placed at exactly 5:55 a.m. The precise time investigators believed Nada's body was pushed out the window. Throughout the morning as police arrived, as chaos erupted, the calls continued. Short bursts of communication. Father and son connected in those dark hours. And 3 weeks before the murder, Muhammad had sent his father a photograph. It showed a window, the window of the guest bedroom, the same window Nada's body would later be thrown from. Muhammad had also conducted an internet search. How to remove a window screen. On the day of the murder, detectives first spoke to Muhammad as a witness. He told them he had been asleep. He had woken up to his sister's screaming. He knew nothing about what happened. But the next day, after reviewing the surveillance video after seeing those shadows, the detectives returned. This time they came with different questions. Basil Altantawi was at the house, summoned to help with the children despite the restraining order. When detectives asked if they could speak with Muhammad again, Basil hesitated. He asked if he should have an attorney present. The detectives assured him this was just standard procedure, just trying to get the timeline down. Nothing to worry about. Basil, perhaps trusting the system, perhaps too shaken to think clearly, agreed. Muhammad and his father asked if they could pray together privately in the basement prayer room. The detectives said no. They could pray in the upstairs family room, within earshot of the officers. Then, Basil needed to pick up Aya from her library bus stop, just 3 miles away. As soon as he left, the detective sat Muhammad down at the dining room table, alone, without his father, without an attorney, a 16-year-old boy facing 2 experienced interrogators. They asked him again, what happened? Muhammad's story began to shift. First, he said he had seen his mother that morning. He had gotten her the cleaning spray. Then he changed his account again. He said he was holding the ladder when she fell out the window. But the detectives knew the truth. They knew Nada had been murdered before that fall. They pressed harder. Muhammad began to crack. He seemed exhausted, confused. At one point, according to transcripts, he said, "I'm going to agree with what you say." The interrogation would later become a subject of legal battles, with Muhammad's defense arguing it had been coercive, that he should have had Miranda warnings, that his constitutional rights had been violated. The courts would ultimately rule the interrogation was legal. The evidence would stand. But in those hours at the dining room table, a 16-year-old boy sat across from detectives who believed he had killed his mother. It would be nearly 5 years before Muhammad al-Tantawi stood trial. 5 years of legal motions, of appeals, of fights over evidence. 5 years during which Aya and her younger sister had to rebuild their shattered lives. Finally, in March of 2022, the trial began in Oakland County Circuit Court. Muhammad, now 20 years old, was charged with first-degree premeditated murder. He had been charged as a juvenile, meaning he faced a different sentencing structure than an adult would. The prosecution, led by John Skrzynski, the county's chief litigator, acknowledged up front that their case was circumstantial. There were no eyewitnesses to the actual killing. There was no DNA evidence linking Muhammad directly to the crime. No bloody fingerprints. No smoking gun. But they had the shadow video. They had the phone records showing the barrage of calls between Muhammad and his father. They had the search history. They had the photograph of the window sent weeks before the murder. They had the autopsy showing asphyxiation. They had a staged crime scene, and they had motive. Muhammad was angry at his mother for the divorce. Angry at her for defying traditional culture. Angry at her for working, for not wearing hijab, for dating another man, and perhaps most significantly, he was protecting his father. Nita had information that could send Basil to prison. A deposition was scheduled in just 2 days. The defense team, led by attorney Michael Schiano, argued that the prosecution's theory was impossible. Muhammad had been only 140 pounds at the time of the murder. Nada weighed 125 pounds. How could a teenage boy overpower and smother a grown woman, then lift her dead weight and hoist her out a window? They suggested alternative suspects. Perhaps one of Nada's former romantic partners. Perhaps a man Basil had hired to watch the house, who had once been found inside uninvited. They argued the crime scene was too pristine. No blood, no DNA, no signs of struggle. This was the work of a professional, they said, not a 16-year-old boy. It's impossible for Muhammad to have done this, Schiano told the jury, but the prosecution countered with testimony that cut to the heart of the case. When Aya Altantawi took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She was 19 years old now, a student at Michigan State University, carrying 5 years of grief and trauma on her shoulders. She told the jury about her brother's relationship with their mother, how it had deteriorated, how Muhammad had become verbally and physically abusive toward Nada, how he blamed their mother for ruining the family. He saw it as a way to take my father's money, my father's house, and ruin his life, Aya testified, her voice breaking at times. She described how Muhammad believed their mother wasn't a good Muslim, how he thought she was taking everything from their father, how after Basil moved out, Muhammad declared himself the man of the house and expected their mother to respect his authority. Aya testified about that morning, how her brother usually showered at night, but that morning around 6 a.m. she heard water running. Why would he be showering at dawn? She remembered screaming when she found her mother's body. She remembered the sound coming from somewhere outside herself, like in movies, where the character realizes they're screaming but doesn't recognize their own voice. And she remembered her brother's reaction, how he seemed dazed, quiet, weird, not the reaction she would have expected from someone who had just discovered his mother dead. Under questioning, Aya was asked about her feelings toward her brother. I think regardless of what happened, I forgive him, she said. But that forgiveness was complicated, tangled up with anger and grief, and a childhood that had ended the moment she saw her mother's body on that patio. Dr. Dragovich took the stand and walked the jury through the autopsy findings. The jury saw photographs, difficult images that showed exactly what had happened to Netta Herania's body. Initially, when he first examined her, the injuries had puzzled him. They didn't fit the pattern of a fall, but then the police shared the surveillance video with him. Those shadows moving in the pre-dawn darkness. This video is telling 100,000 words, Dragovich said again, emphasizing each word. He explained the evidence of asphyxiation, the way her lungs showed signs of nasal and oral blockage, the damp cloth found near her body, which he testified may have contributed to her smothering, though he couldn't say with absolute certainty. She had suffered a blunt force injury to her head when she hit the stucco ledge on the way down, but she was already dead by then. Already gone. The prosecution also presented evidence about that damp cloth, about the chemical smell the paramedic had noticed, about the bottle of Taalax on the ladder, about the washing machine in the laundry room that had automatically shut off containing clothes and a rubber mat, about that mat later being found in a plastic bag, hidden inside a hamper under other clothes. Someone had been trying to clean up, trying to erase evidence. The trial lasted 4 days. The jury heard testimony from police officers, from the medical examiner, from Aya, from forensic experts who analyzed the phone records and surveillance footage. They heard from the defense's witnesses too. The former romantic partner of Nada's, who testified about their relationship but who had no apparent motive for murder. The man who had been hired to watch the house, who explained the incident where he'd let himself in uninvited, startling Aya, but who also had alibis and no real connection to the crime. In his closing arguments, Skrzyński spent approximately 2 hours walking through the evidence. The timeline, the phone calls, the shadow video, the staged scene, the motive. It all fits, he told the jury. It all fits. Schiano countered that the prosecution wanted the jury to speculate, to guess, to fill in gaps with assumptions rather than evidence. "There's no physical evidence connecting Muhammad to this murder whatsoever," he said. The jury began deliberating on a Monday morning. They considered both first-degree premeditated murder and second-degree murder charges. Less than 3 hours later, they returned with their verdict. Guilty of first-degree premeditated murder, Muhammad al-Tantawi, who had been looking down when the verdict was announced, showed no reaction. No tears. No outburst. Nothing. He had killed his mother. The jury was certain beyond reasonable doubt. His sentencing hearing took place in September of 2022, more than 5 years after Nada's death. It would stretch nearly 4 hours and become a spectacle of dysfunction and anger. The prosecution had initially requested life without parole, but withdrew that request after a Supreme Court ruling found that sentencing juveniles to life without parole constituted cruel and unusual punishments. Instead, Judge Martha Anderson would have discretion in determining the sentence within certain guidelines. Multiple victim impact statements were read. Family members from Syria and London described Nada as kind and generous. With the most amazing heart and soul, they requested the maximum possible sentence. Some alleged that Muhammad had been pressured by his father to commit the murder. Then it was Aya's turn to address the court directly. "These past 5 years have been a lot," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I've tried to sympathize. I've tried to be empathetic." She spoke of the heartache and intense trauma she had endured. Of how she didn't know what to do with her life now that the trial was over. Of how that morning had stolen her childhood. Her sense of safety. Her mother, looking directly at her brother, she said, "I don't know why you did what you did. I knew you hated us, but I didn't know you hated us this much." She told the court, told her brother, told everyone present, he could die today, and I would not go to his funeral. I would throw a party instead. I don't care about him. The courtroom erupted. At one point, Aya began yelling and swearing, her composure finally breaking after years of holding it together. She was removed from the courtroom, her voice echoing as she was led away. And Basil al-Tantawi tried to give his own victim impact statement, but almost immediately, Judge Anderson cut him off. He wasn't talking about how Nada's death had affected him. He was praising his son, calling Muhammad loving, caring, a role model who had never been in trouble. "A victim impact statement is how the death of your wife impacted you," Judge Anderson said, her frustration mounting. "It's not to glorify your son." She ordered him to sit down. Throughout the hearing, Muhammad represented himself for portions of it. He rambled. He argued with the judge. He interrupted repeatedly. He claimed the pre-sentencing report was wrong, that everyone was trying to do him in, that he was the victim of a vast conspiracy. 5 years ago, I got arrested for the worst crime imaginable, and I am innocent, he insisted. He claimed he didn't smother his mother, didn't asphyxiate her, didn't kill her in any way. He said the police had millions of other suspects they had ignored. He expressed faith that his conviction would be overturned on appeal. Judge Anderson had to admonish him multiple times to stop interrupting, to stop arguing, to let her do her job. At one point she reflected aloud. Listening to him today has left me wondering who he sees as the victim. I think he views himself as the victim, and not actually his mother. Finally she announced the sentence. 35 to 60 years in prison. Muhammad al-Tantawi would be eligible for parole in August of 2052, when he would be 51 years old. He would spend the prime of his life behind bars. He would never attend college, never have a normal career, never have a family of his own. As part of his sentence, he was prohibited from having any contact with his mother's relatives, but would be allowed contact with his sisters and father. Sheriff's deputies shackled him and led him away. Today, Muhammad al-Tantawi is 23 years old. He is incarcerated at the Chippewa Correctional Facility in Kinross, Michigan, a mixed-security prison in the state's Upper Peninsula. He has been there since his sentencing, maintaining his innocence, believing that somehow, someday, his conviction will be overturned. His appeals have been unsuccessful. The evidence stands. The verdict holds. Aya al-Tantawi continues her life, carrying the weight of that morning, of the trial, of being the daughter and sister in a family torn apart by violence and death. She has tried to move forward. She has pursued her education, but the trauma remains, woven into the fabric of who she is now. Basil al-Tantawi, the father and husband at the center of so much of this story, remains free. He was never charged with any crime related to Nada's death. The GPS tether data placed him miles away at the time of the murder. But questions linger about those phone calls, about the influence he may have had, about the anger he planted in his son's heart. And Nada Hirania, the energetic, beautiful, dedicated personal trainer and group exercise instructor, remains gone. She was 35 years old when she died. With so much life still ahead of her, she had been building something new, something free, something entirely her own. She had been 2 days away from a deposition that might have brought more truth to light. Her friends at the Franklin Athletic Club remember her smile. Her clients remember her encouragement. Her daughters remember a mother who tried to protect them, who tried to show them that women could be strong, independent, could live authentically. On the morning of August 21st, 2017, in that mansion in Farmington Hills, a shadow moved across a lawn. A window stood open to the pre-dawn air, and a woman's life ended at the hands of the person who should have protected her most. Her own son. The shadow in the window told a story that took 5 years to fully unravel. A story of control and tradition colliding with independence and change. A story of a son who chose his father's anger over his mother's life. A story that left 2 sisters without their mother, without their brother, without the family they once knew. And in the quiet hours of the early morning, in suburbs across the country, in homes that look peaceful from the outside, other shadows move, other secrets hide, other families struggle with tensions that most of us will never see. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care.